We are going to spend some time talking about our classifying 2D figures unit. This unit has 2 readiness standards and 2 supporting standards, and we want to be really sure we know what students are coming from kindergarten with the knowledge of and what we are adding to that knowledge in first grade. So we're going to start with 1.6a, where students are expected to classify and sort regular and irregular 2D figures. So that's 2 different verbs, classify and sort. And then what are we sorting? We're sorting regular and irregular. That doesn't mean kids have to define what is regular and what is irregular. It means you need to present them with a variety of shapes that are regular and irregular. And they're to do this using informal geometric language. Now, when we get to 1.6d, we're going to be expecting them to use formal geometric language. So one thing that's going to be important in this particular standard is that when students use informal geometric language, teachers paraphrase that with the correct academic vocabulary. So like, instead of corner, vertex or vertices. So we're making sure that we're using proper academic language. So let's talk about what do students learn about in kindergarten. So in kindergarten, there are a couple of standards that support this, this particular first grade TEK. K6A is the first one. K6A is their Identify TEK, just like you have an Identify TEK. Their Identify TEK requires circle, rectangle, square, and triangle. That's all. In first grade, we add hexagon and we add rhombus. So they've identified these before. They've worked with them. K6E, they classified and sorted a variety of regular and irregular 2D and 3D figures, regardless of their size and orientation. So they've worked with classifying and sorting. They've worked with regular and irregular figures. So K6E is their classify and sort. And they classified and sorted 2D and 3D. We are only expected to classify and sort regular and irregular 2D figures in this unit. We'll work with 3D figures a little bit later. So let's talk about a couple of important things. When we're asking kids to sort and classify, we could ask them to sort and classify figures into regular or irregular groups, polygons or non-polygons, quadrilaterals, non-quadrilaterals, triangles, non-triangles, rectangle, non-rectangle. This is the one that gets them when you say rectangle and non-rectangle. Most students want to put a square as a non-rectangle. A square is a rectangle, and that's part of their kindergarten standard. They learn in kindergarten that a square is a special kind of rectangle. So when we say rectangle, we mean a square also. By definition, a square is a rectangle. A rectangle is not a square, but a square is a rectangle. So if I ask you to classify these figures that I have here into 2 groups, either rectangles or non-rectangles, these 2 would be in the rectangle group. These would not be in the rectangle group. So 1.6b, students are asked to distinguish between the attributes that define a 2D shape and attributes that do not define a 2D shape. So we're all about attributes here. So we want attributes that define and ones that do not define. So let's talk about what that means. When I'm asking you about the attributes that define a shape, I'm talking about the number of sides, number of vertices. I could ask you about whether the sides are straight or curved. Those are attributes that define the shape. If I'm talking about attributes that do not define the shape, I'm talking about things like color, size, and orientation. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I look at this hexagon, it is a hexagon whether it's blue, purple, yellow, green, polka dotted, striped, spotted, doesn't matter. If it's got 6 straight sides and it's a closed figure, it is a hexagon. So the color of it doesn't matter. I could show you a really big hexagon. I could show you a really small hexagon. The attributes that define it don't change based on its size. Orientation doesn't change what a figure is called. So it is an attribute that does not define the figure. It doesn't matter if I stand it up. It doesn't matter if I lay it down. It doesn't matter how I turn it. It doesn't matter if I flip it over. If I look at this rhombus, it doesn't matter if it's this way or this way or this way. It doesn't matter which way I orient it. It is still a rhombus because of the attributes that define it, not the way I turn it. So there are a couple of super important things in this unit. One, we need to make sure that we're presenting students with a variety of figures. So we can't only show one kind of rhombus, one look of a rhombus. We have to show a variety, because what we find in upper grades is students are coming with this idea that this is a rhombus and nothing else is a rhombus. They come with the idea that this is a triangle and nothing else is a triangle. So we need to make sure that we're presenting a variety of shapes. So yes, this is a triangle. But besides a traditional equilateral triangle, kids could see a right triangle. Kids could see a crazy triangle. Kids could see a triangle that stands up really tall. So we have to present a variety of figures so that we're not reinforcing this idea that this is the only kind of triangle, and unless it looks like this, it's not a triangle. So make sure there's a variety of shape, of a variety of sizes and shapes of triangles. So variety is the spice of life. It's the name of the game. Okay, 1-6C, that's the next one I want us to talk about. 1-6C, the verb for students, let me move some of my stuff out of the way. The verb for students is create. The verb create isn't for teachers. It's a student verb. All of our TEKS are student verbs. So they all say the student will, not the teacher will create. The student will create 2D figures, and it lists the same ones that we talked about earlier. Circle, triangle, rectangle, square as a special rectangle, rhombus, and hexagon. So they need to be using what they know about that shape's attributes to create that figure. So let's say I ask you, create a shape with 4 equal sides. The students should be using tools, so they could use manipulatives, they could use things like spaghetti, straws, toothpicks, strings, beads, to create that figure that matches the attributes that you give them. You could then ask the student, what could you change in this figure to create a new shape? So take the shape that you created and change it to make a new shape, and now tell us of the attributes of the shape that you made. So let's say I gave you the attributes of a square, and I asked you, how could you change that to make a different shape? And let's say they stretched it and made it into a rectangle. So what's different about the attributes now compared to what you made first? In kindergarten, this goes along with K6F, and their verb was create also. So they created 2D figures using a variety of materials and drawings. So that goes right hand in hand with your standard. This is a great opportunity to use geoboards. Now, I understand that there's an app for geoboards. Here's what I'm going to say to you. Let's get back to best practices of doing things with hands-on when we can. When we don't have the means to do that, then technology is a great tool to use. But when we can, we need to build foundational understanding with concrete tools. And technology is not a concrete tool. So we always want to go concrete to pictorial to abstract. Technology is a great tool for pictorial. It's not a great tool for concrete. So let's make sure we're using those best practices to use the physical tools to create these shapes. Then, once you've moved past that and you want to move to a pictorial, then use what you can on your iPad. Record their description. They can still build the shape using actual manipulatives, and then they could take a picture of it and use Chatterpix and describe the attributes of it without doing all of the building on the iPad. Let's use the iPad for other things to extend their learning, but not for the concrete part of their learning. Okay, and last TEK in this unit is K6D, and this is our Identify TEK. This tells us the shapes that we have to identify, which we've talked about: hexagon, rectangle, square as a special rectangle, triangles, rhombus, and circle. So we want to make sure we're identifying all of these, but the difference in this standard and what we talked about earlier is with formal geometric language. So here's where we're going to make sure that we are expecting proper academic language for this part. So we've reinforced all the way through. By the time we get to the end of our unit, our students need to be using formal academic language. The only way you can assess that is to listen to kids and make sure that they're using formal academic language. So again, in this one, we should be talking about the vertices, not corners. We should be naming it by sides, the number of sides, the number of vertices, all the same attributes, but making sure that we're using formal geometric language as we identify the shapes that are required of a first grade student in these standards. For this particular standard, if you look back at K6A, this was their Identify TEK, and K6D is their identifying attributes of 2D shapes using informal and formal geometric language interchangeably. So this is their describing. But notice, in their standard, they were able to use formal and informal language interchangeably. Here, we expect them to use formal. So that's how we've moved beyond what the kindergarten standard is. In addition to adding 2 additional figures, we also are expecting to be able to use formal language. Please let me know if you have any questions at all.